In this episode of the BBK video installation series, I'm going to show you how to install BBK's innovative new 1780 throttle intake for 1996 to 2004 Mustang GTs. This unique intake elbow with an integrated 78mm throttle body will not only improve the performance potential of your Mustang, but it also looks much better than any other elbow available. Let's get started by removing the original intake elbow. First, disconnect the electrical connections at the idle air controller and throttle position sensors. Then move on to disconnecting all of the vacuum connections as shown here. Now unbolt the throttle cable bracket and unclip the cruise control and throttle connections from the linkage. Loosen the hose clamp at the intake inlet coupler and pull the inlet tube back away from the throttle body. Remove the two bolts that hold the EGR to the driver's side of the elbow and discard the gasket. We've supplied a new one for you. Now we can remove the 5 mounting bolts that attach the elbow to the intake manifold. With all of the bolts removed, you can simply lift the intake elbow off of the engine to remove it. Be sure not to drop anything into the open intake manifold. Now we can move to the assembly sequence. Let's go over and identify the BBK supplied pieces. This is the TPS bushing. If your TPS happens to be shallow, you'll use this to bridge the gap. We've also supplied new TPS mounting bolts. New stainless steel hardware for attaching the BBK unit to the intake manifold. Notice there are only 4 mounting holes in the BBK unit. There are 2 new throttle cable mounting bracket bolts. And we've also supplied a new gasket for the idle air controller and the EGR valve. Early 4.6 GTs were fitted with a small pressed-in vacuum nipple shown here in the elbow. Later models had a larger nipple here. For this reason we supply both. Identify the correct nipple and toss the one that you don't need. Moving on, remove the idle air control valve from the stock elbow and discard the gasket. Next, remove the throttle position sensor. With the bolts removed, take a moment to feel the spring-loaded action of the TPS sensor. It's slightly spring-loaded. You'll need to make sure that it has the same action once it's installed onto the BBK unit. Now install the correct size nipple for your application into the BBK unit. The top of the nut-like portion of the nipple will need to be flush with or below the idle air control mounting surface. Be sure not to over-tighten this, it's just made of plastic. Lay the new idle air controller gasket down and install the original IAC with the original hardware. Notice that the nut portion of the nipple is under the IAC valve. This is why the nipple needs to be down far enough to clear. Check the TPS bushing to see if it's needed. There's no spring-loaded action here, so we'll toss it out. With the bushing out, I can now feel the action in the TPS. Attach the TPS with the new bolts. Now that we've swapped all the parts, we can take the assembled BBK 1780 to the car and install it. Be sure to wipe off the O-ring style gasket that's part of the intake manifold. Be sure not to let anything get into the intake while it's open. Set the BBK unit onto the intake, then align and tighten the supplied bolts. Reattach the throttle cable connections to the linkage first before mounting the bracket to the BBK unit using the supplied bolts. Reattach the EGR valve using the supplied gasket and the stock bolts. Reestablish all of the vacuum and electrical connections. Then reattach the inlet air tube and all of its connections.